It should be the Treasury that is responsible for demand management. It should not the central bank. But the reason this is there is because of the fundamental. But the reason this is there is because of which is perpetuated today, and I will explain that. Perpetuated the third, and I will explain that. I come back to the subject matter. The third is that's where I come back to central bank. The subject matter. The third is now why this is important. So I'm going to give the punchline now. Is now why this is all agree. So I'm going to give the punchline. We do not want political interference. We can all agree in bureaucratic decision making. I think we all agree with that because we've had so many bad experiences. I think we all agree that also applies to the central bank. But not only the central bank, it should apply to all bureaucratic institutions in Sri Lanka. Not just apply to political interference in the central bank, in Sri Lanka. Not just because this is what has really ruined all the administrative because this is what Sri Lanka. We all agree with that. The administrative system in Sri Lanka. Let's see now what has happened with this trajectory. Let's see now what has happened in lots of countries. This trajectory, not just what you political interference in lots of countries. Not just what you crony capitalism is. What happens is the banking and financial sector have taken over the central banks of the world. What happens is the banking and anyone that disagrees with me as far as of the world. Anyone that disagrees is not opening their eyes. Goldman Sachs is not opening their eyes. Did the entire bailout of the financial sector in 2008 bailout of the financial there's a very famous entity called AIG, which was at the heart of the collapse of the system. AIG. Goldman Sachs that actually was one of the perpetrators of the 2008 crisis actually was asked to give one of their vice presidents crisis to run AIG to give one of their as part of the rescue attempt. And AIG owed money to Goldman Sachs. This is one of the most ridiculous. AIG owed money to Goldman Sachs. This is one of the most ridiculous. The Federal Reserve is colonized by Wall Street. Now that is because the Federal Reserve let's cut is colonized. That is a fact. That's an absolute fact. It's not a conspiracy theory. You just have to read any financial blog. It's not a conspiracy theory. You just have to read sense of independence, and they repeat the same thing. We can give you chapter and verse showing you exactly how they repeat the same. The financial sector controls Wall Street. We now have the example today. Today, we now have the Federal Reserve having a cushion of $2 trillion the Federal Reserve to support a cushion of banks in the United States. They don't do it for companies, but they're doing it for banks in the United States. Whereas they don't do it for companies, central but they're doing it for banks. So we have to guard against not only bureaucrats infringing. We have to guard against not only we have to guard against the financial sector, on the dominating and taking it over for their own purposes. The financial sector. So now you can all go, taking it because I've said my 3 points. So now you can all go. Let me just do it briefly now. 3 points. So let me repeat it. Just do it briefly. The first thing that bothers me completely. Let me repeat it. Is the first thing that bothers me completely. We focus is in the Monetary Law Act on only control of inflation. In the Monetary Law Act, this comes from only actually a discredited economics. This comes from economics is that the money phenomena like inflation and balance of payments is separate from real phenomena like inflation and balance of economic growth and employment. Is separate from two separate things. Like so, when I want to deal with monetary separate things like inflation. So when I want to deal policy, monetary phenomena like inflation, that shouldn't affect growth. Now that has been discredited and discarded. Shouldn't affect growth. We know now that monetary policy, interest rate policy does impact. We know on economic policy and employment policy. Therefore, you can't have this separation of the central bank's policies Therefore, you can't attempting to control inflation, central banks having a damaging impact on economic growth. Attempting to control inflation, and that is why you cannot say that the central bank is charged, and that is why you cannot say controlling inflation. The central bank whatever policies only it pursues controlling inflation, because whatever policies for not just growth and employment, but also lots of other things like income distribution, not just growth and that is why the ECB and the Federal Reserve and that is why the ECB and the Federal Reserve objectives as well. So central banks, when they set interest rates, they have to consider the banks when they set interest rates for these other economic phenomena. The implications now in the 19 these other economic phenomena. I think Professor Jill Pires will remember a lot of the debates then where the IMF told Professor us Jill Pires will remember that low inflation was a precondition of economic growth. That low inflation was a precondition of economic growth. Later, and they were insisting that view was discredited. And it was discredited by Joseph Stiglitz, who ran a huge research project by Joseph Stiglitz, in which he actually showed research for developing countries there wasn't this relationship which the IMF was claiming. There wasn't that you had to get low or zero inflation in order to promote economic growth. You had to get low but the damage was done to many countries, and I remember we were having lots of fights with the IMF to many countries here in Sri Lanka. But today, nobody accepts that anymore, here in Sri Lanka, which is very important today, because remember, we're always told trust the experts, which is very important. But there, the experts got it wrong. We're always told they damaged a lot of countries. But there, the experts got it wrong. We have to be very careful with those views. So this is why we have to be very careful with those views. These other approaches. We have other central banks approaches. Broader approaches, other just central bank inflation. Now, broader approaches. This is a little bit of controlling inflation. Quantity theory, which I just want to. This is a little. Remember, I told you it's been discredited. But theory, now just be very specific about. Remember, I told you it's been discredited. But let me now just be very specific. Quantity theory tells us that the old, when the central bank prints cash, that when the central bank finances the budget deficit. But not only finances the budget deficit, injects a lot of cash into the system. Only finances the budget deficit, it increases, injects a lot of money stock, M2. Sorry, I'm getting a bit more technical, but the money stock. I think we need to do that. Sorry, I'm at this stage. A bit more technical. It increases M2. I think we need to do that. Which is at this stage. Deposits. It increases M2. Okay, which increases. Deposits held by all of us. And when our bank balances increase, we spend more money. And when our bank balances increase, we spend more money. We cause prices of domestic goods to rise. We cause prices of domestic goods to rise. So this creates inflation. We import a lot of goods. Results in balance of payments problems. So this creates inflation. Now, when we have balance of payments problems. To bridge now, when we have balance between inflows and outflows of foreign exchange, to bridge we borrow between inflows and accumulate foreign exchange, eventually getting into a debt problem. Accumulate foreign debt. The source of the problem is this cash. Into a debt problem. Okay, so and now the source of the problem Monetary Law Act says. In order to solve our monetary law act, we've got to control the cash. In order to solve, and they're very specific. They say we have to control the cash, and they're very specific. To the government, they say we have to control when the government runs a budget deficit. Given to the government, they don't say we have to control the government, which is also a bit strange, isn't it? I mean, it's a hell of an anomaly. Which is also a bit strange. Cash is causing inflation, then it's cash to everyone. Because if cash is causing inflation, then foreign exchange comes into the country. So the central bank has to convert that foreign exchange into rupees. The central bank has to convert that foreign exchange into rupees. So therefore, the central bank should try and suck that cash out of the system as well. So therefore, the central bank should try and every single time more cash comes in. The central bank has to do something about it. More cash comes in. Fortunately, today, to do something about we now have a lot of evidence to show this is actually rubbish. We now have a lot of evidence to show. Let me just go through very, very briefly the way it's done today. Let me just go if you go to the Bank of England site, or if you go to the Federal Reserve, so if you go to the Bank of England Reserve Bank, or if you go to the Australian Federal Reserve, if you go to the Reserve Bank, giving me warning signs already, Australia, then you see this is the first thing that you're going to see. Then there's no link between the cash base that you're going to see and M2. There's no link. That's broken down completely. Okay, it's highly variable, therefore there's no point controlling the cash base to try and control. It's highly variable, therefore there's no point M2 first and then inflation to try and control. So that's what everyone now agrees. M2 first and then inflation. And now, so that's what everyone also go to those sites, they say, in fact, central bank should never. If you also go to those sites, control the cash base. In fact, central bank should never. All monetary policies fundamentally interest rates. That's why not controlling monetary policies fundamentally. And I can't use interest rates to actually control the cash base. That also. And I can't use interest being discarded and control the cash base. That also. It's now been agreed, and this is the most controversial thing, but it's now in the last 5 years. Agreed, and this is the most controversial thing. Bank of England Governor Mervyn King saying, and it came with the Bank of England Governor Mervyn King saying, when a bank gives credit extends credit to businesses or individuals, they actually credit to businesses or individuals. They credit your account with a certain amount of money. They credit your deposit account. With a certain this means it's the of money. Commercial bank that's creating M2. This means whenever they make a loan, commercial bank that's creating actually M2. Increasing M2. Whenever they make a loan, so it's not the central bank increasing M2, the quantity of cash, so it's not, but it's central bank, the commercial banks increasing M2 every time they make a loan, and that's now accepted by all the central banks in the world. There's no central bank, with the exception of Sri Lanka, that actually believes this. And this is why I think that we need to discuss this. There needs to be some discussion of why is it Sri Lanka is the only central bank in the world that seems to be believing this sort of thing. And now we know there's no relationship between M2 and inflation. That is now dead and buried, you know. So please don't resurrect that, because it's now being buried empirically. I can't get to the next one. Am I doing something wrong? Just okay, I was going to give you 3 graphs, but I'm going to skip the graphs because I've already exceeded my time. And the graphs just simply show you that the relationship between M2 and inflation doesn't exist, even in Sri Lanka's case. So those people who say the inflation hike in recent times is due to inflation have never presented any data to show that. Whereas I have presented data to show that it's the increase in oil prices that have increased inflation in all countries in the world, not just in Sri Lanka. So, you know, this is actually incorrect for anyone to say. And I'm, again, not the only one to say that. Many people have said that. I come to the very last point. And this point is that if we implement the Monetary Law Act, I predict we will have continuous deflationary pressures in the economy, which means that the growth will stagnate. This is what I'm predicting. And most importantly, we will never, ever be able to use in the economy, budget, which means that the growth will stagnate. This is what I'm predicting. For example, and most 2020-21, the IMF congratulated Sri Lanka for running a huge budget deficit. world shock and never said anything about us 2020, 21 that deficit. Why? Because every country in the world did the same thing. A huge every country, and there's no exception to it, never said printed money to fund the deficit, to finance IMF the deficit. All the Western countries congratulated Sri Lanka. Every country, and there's no exception to it, printed money. IMF is not saying, "Oh, we congratulated you, you did great. Here's money to help you." No, they're saying, "Naughty Sri Lanka, you've done the worst thing possible, and now we're going to punish you for it because you've run out of reserves." I think this again is disingenuous of the IMF. In future, supposing we're hit with a world shock, the government, if it wants to run a budget deficit, is going to have enormous upward pressure on interest rates because remember, the central bank can't finance the deficit ever again. We'll have to go to the market. And then interest rates, you've seen them at 30%, I would forecast 50% in future, because the central bank will not be able to pick up any treasury bills ever again. And then the speculative vultures will have a field day, like they are at the moment. Everybody loves this situation if you have money, but if you're a business person, this is catastrophe. You will have volatility of interest rates and exchange rates. I don't need to tell you about this because actually we just had an episode now. Our exchange rate goes from 370 to 320 and under. I was told in Petar I could even get 302 against the dollar at one stage. It's come back again. But do you know what that has meant for hoteliers? Do you know what that has meant for exporters? It's insane. And it's even more insane that we're now back to 340 and we're likely to go to 400. I mean, you can't allow variables like this to go up and down like yo-yos and think that you're actually creating an investment climate in the country. You remember how everyone was congratulating themselves, "Oh, we've got the strongest currency in the world." Doing what? Doing what exactly? Hoping the IMF is coming and giving us bags of money. And this is mad. This is totally insane. If the central bank had any sense whatsoever, they would have controlled the exchange rate and not allowed its appreciation. And then they admitted to us, actually, we printed a lot of money and tried to hold down the exchange rate because it was appreciating so much. So they already admitted they are doing what they said they wouldn't do, interfere by printing money. You're going to see the same thing with the interest rates. This is all I say. This is my last. Sorry, Sarima. Basically, I said it at the beginning, and what you're going to get is this. You are going to get increasingly control of our monetary policy by not just the financial sector, by foreign influence. Now, I find it really strange that the governor of the central bank says when he recently set interest rates, he did it in consultation with the IMF. Who the hell is the IMF to tell us what interest rates we should set for our country? IMF can say, look, if you want this money, you have to get, let's say, your budget deficit under control, you have to bring down debt and things like that. How dare they actually tell us what interest rates we should have? And the governor himself admits that they didn't like it because they wanted 100 basis points increase in basically the central bank's loan rate. Now, this is insane. I mean, we're talking about independent central bank, and he's actually admitting that the IMF influenced the interest rate policy. Worse still, the the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations actually said that a condition for them supporting the bailout of Sri Lanka was that Sri Lanka passed the Monetary Law Act, where we have to have a more independent central bank. Really? Now the US is saying something like that. Why? Because the US is going to use the connections they have to control our monetary policy. And let me remind you that a famous Rothschild said, you can elect who you want, but if I control your monetary policy, I control you. And that is basically what is happening now. It's not just in Sri Lanka, it's every developing country. The IMF is coming with exactly the same message. We want you to make your central banks independent. Independent of whom? Independent of our democratic process, but controlled by foreigners. And that's what it's about. Now, here's the thing, the very last thing, sorry, Sirma, this is absolutely the last thing. There is no economic sense in this quantity theory. They think we're a bunch of dummies because nobody accepts these relationships. I've told you this and I've shown it to you. So why is the IMF doing this to us? Why? You know, because they want the control. And they hope that nobody objects to it. They hope that we keep our mouth shut. They hope we don't actually read, which looks like the case. And when I look at what the governor is talking about, it looks like he hasn't read a damn thing in the last 30 years, you know? And this is very dangerous to us because IMF does not have any substance in what they're telling us. My last challenge to them, please bring some of your so-called economists, your so-called experts, and sit here and have a debate with us. I know they won't do it because I know they know the same economics that I know. Indrajit has come here to do that. Good, Indrajit. I think that's very courageous. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Howard. And you gave a very good reason why we should tear off those pages on money and inflation from our macroeconomic books. It's the new Central Bank Act which is going to be the cause of our future inflation. That's what you said. So let me invite Professor Sirimon Kolombage for the next presentation. 20 minutes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sirimal, Venerable Sir, former governors of the Central Bank, my friends, distinguished guests, and dear students. I would like to thank the Sri Lanka Economic Association for inviting me to share some of my thoughts with you. Perhaps I may disagree with what we have been debating over the last 40 years or so on these issues. So, as Professor Sirimal said, why should we have an act? We already have the Monetary Law Act, which has been there for the last 75 years. You know, it was introduced in 1949, and today, 2023, and we are trying to do away with the old act. So that's a bad guy. The current Monetary Law Act is the bad guy, and we are going to have a new act. So I would like to focus on, I have a question mark, as Howard says about independent central banking. I have a big question mark. One would raise the question why the central bank should not be independent, or why the central bank should be regulated by the government as just like any other state-owned enterprise, say the water board, electricity board, shipping corporation, or even some other organization like Sri Lanka Telecom. What is so special about central bank? The answer lies in the supreme power that the central bank holds in printing money. I think two governors, former governors are here. They know it very well. The central bank has the unique power to issue notes and coins, what we call in economics, it's currency. And publicly it is known as money printing. So when the central bank issues currency, it has a multiplier effect on the money supply, as already elaborated by Professor Howard Nicholas. The notes and coins are circulated, and some part of those notes and coins are deposited in commercial banks. What the commercial banks do is they disburse credit to their customers and what we call money creation. So if you take the notes and coins issued by the central bank in a particular country, maybe multiple times in the case of Sri Lanka, the credit issued by the demand and fixed deposits of the commercial banks comes to about 7 to 8 times of the currency issued by the central bank. So whenever the central bank issues currency, it has a multiplier effect on the liquidity system in the country. That is why many economists argued that the central bank should be an independent body. And when the government finds an easy way to finance its deficit, whenever there is a deficit, the government depends on the central bank to borrow money. When the government borrows money, what the central bank does is the central bank purchases government securities, which are treasury bills and treasury bonds from the government. And to that amount, the central bank issues currency. This is public known as printing money. So I would like to make a clarification on an issue raised by Professor Nicholas. That is, Professor Nicholas mentioned that the Central Bank of Sri Lanka is the only central bank in the world that applies cash-based to in the monetary policy. In fact, to be fair by the central bank, I must say that the Central Bank of Sri Lanka gave up regulating the monetary base long ago, maybe 2 decades ago. So it's no longer the reserve base that is used by the central bank, but the central bank started using open market operations and policy interest rates as the two key instruments during the last few decades. So I would like to make that correction. And there's a term called time inconsistency. Why should the government keep away from the central bank? As I already mentioned, whenever the government borrows money from the central bank, it has a tremendous impact on the overall liquidity of the system. And that will lead to accelerate inflation. Of course, Professor Nicholas has a different view. He says that there is no relationship between money supply and inflation. But I would like to argue that there is a close relationship between the money supply and inflation in many countries, and including Sri Lanka. And so what happens is, as we all know, politicians have a very short-term vision. They want to face I beg your pardon, Professor. I didn't mean to say that. But in general, all over the world, the governments, the politicians run the governments, and they want to go to the electorate. So they have to win the election to come into power again. So they have in general, the politicians and the governments have a short-term vision in the sense that they want to create more employment, they want to give more jobs to the youngsters, and also they want to give more and more welfare facilities to the people. So I think from their point of view, we can't blame the politicians or the government. But what happens is when such short-term policies are applied, that will lead again to raise inflation. Why? The government will have to depend on the banking system to borrow money to finance the deficit. So that will lead to accelerate inflation once again, and that will lead to raise the cost of living, create uncertainty, and it will erode the investment climate of the country. This is the point why the central bank independence is important. So this is called the time inconsistency problem in monetary policy. That is when politicians and the governments have a short-term vision to satisfy the voters, and that will lead to, in fact, that will have a short-term benefit, but at the same time, that will lead to accelerate inflation in the long run. I think we are experiencing it now. About 5 or 6 years ago, there was an increase in the money supply, and I'm not saying, Professor Nicholas, that the money supply is the only cause for the current inflation, but that has been the main cause. And since I'm running short of time, I will run through my presentation quickly. So there are two views about central bank independence. One school argues that the central bank should be an independent authority, as I explained now. And there is another school of thought which argues that the central bank should be regulated by the government, because the elected government has to deliver the policies and not by an elitist group in the central bank. So in practice, the central banks operate between these two extreme paradigms. And there are two types of central bank independence. One is the goal independence, GOAL, goal independence, and instrument independence. It is generally accepted that goal independence should be left to the elected government. I think this is where the conflict between democracy and central bank independence arises. So this is the reconciliation part. So the goal independence of the central bank would be left to the government, and the central bank can have the instrument independence. Now I would like to argue that the term independent is somewhat misleading. When you say that the central bank should be independent, what do we mean by that? One could think that the central bank can act on its own, like a bull in the China shop, central bank can do whatever it likes. But that is not the case. What we mean by central bank independence is rule-based, I would underline that, rule-based monetary policy, which can be targeted towards the mandated goal, that is price stability. I think Professor Nicholas mentioned once that Milton Friedman rejected the central bank independence. Am I correct? Okay, right. Okay, I'm sorry. So in an essay published in 1962 by Milton Friedman, who is the founding father of quantitative theory of money, reputed economist, and he rejected the two extreme ideas of a completely regulated central bank and a fully independent central bank. So he dismissed both ideas, fully independent central bank and also fully regulated. So what Friedman suggested was a rule-based monetary policy as against discretionary monetary policy. I will come to this discretionary monetary policy little later. So basically in several countries like Argentina, Turkey, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe experienced the erosion of central banks' independence, credibility, erosion of the central bank independence, and its credibility, and it has led to raise the money supply and inflation rates. Now, unfortunately, Sri Lanka is facing the same situation. And once the conduct of monetary policy is greatly influenced by politics and the government, it's very difficult to revive the credibility and independence of the central bank. And I would like to argue here that central bank independence is not a new thing to Sri Lanka. It's not a new thing. I may quote the finance minister, J.R. Jayawardena, who was the finance minister in 1949. Professor G.L. Paris, he made this statement at the parliament debate. So when he presented the monetary law bill, which is now Monetary Law Act, so he presented the monetary law bill in 1949 in the parliament to establish the central bank. The then finance minister, J.R. Jayawardena state, I quote, "It is very difficult to say that the central bank should be entirely a department of the government or subservient to the government. We have tried as far as we could in this act to make the central bank, or at least the monetary board, independent as far as its advice is concerned." So this, I unquote. So this is a statement made by the then finance minister J.R. Jayawardena in 1949. So central bank independence is not a new thing. And there is an inbuilt mechanism in the present Monetary Law Act to function the central bank as an autonomous body. So we could say that the central bank has enjoyed a certain amount of autonomy since its inception. Then I would like to say a few words about monetary policy rules versus discretion. In fact, the superiority, it is considered that rule-based monetary policy is superior to discretionary monetary policy. This is found by Taylor in 1993. So according to the Taylor rule, the central bank should conduct monetary policy, particularly the adjustment of interest rates on the basis of some formula. He says that the central bank should adjust the interest rates in response to macroeconomic activity and anticipated inflation rate. And I have applied the Taylor rule for Sri Lanka a couple of years ago, and I found that the Central Bank of Sri Lanka has not followed the Taylor rule, because in most years, particularly after 1990, the policy rates or interest rates of the central bank varied drastically from the rule-based theory. So I would say that the monetary policy adopted by the central bank, particularly since 2019, is a classic example of discretionary monetary policy. By 2019, the government had accumulated sizable amount of domestic and foreign debt used for various pet projects like highways, airports, ports, so on and so forth. And these were not subject to any rigorous project evaluation. And as a result, these pet projects did not generate sufficient government revenue to pay back the debt to foreign creditors or domestic lenders. So as a result, the government had a huge budget deficit. The government had not only to finance, and the government had to finance, had to service the debt over and above meeting its current and capital expenditure. So that was a huge task. And what the government did was it turned to the central bank and asked for money. So since 2019, we have observed that the money supply has gone up. In fact, the central bank was pressurized, and we can't blame the central bank. It was pressurized by the authorities, political authority, to print money. So the central bank followed the theory called modern monetary theory. And as a result, the money supply went up. And today we are experiencing a high inflation, foreign reserve depletion, and everything is unbalanced today. So the central bank has reversed the easy monetary policy last year, middle of last year, and now they have adopted the tight, what is called the tight monetary policy. But what happens is, while, as Professor Nicholas mentioned, while the central bank regulates or discourages private sector credit, I think it's the opposite that you said. The central bank has raised the interest rates to 30 to 40%. The central bank raised its policy rates by about 700 basis points, I think. So as a result, you can see a rise in the market interest rates, lending rates, and deposit rates. So what happens is that while the central bank discourages private credit, it continues to lend to the government. And as a result, still we can see that the central bank is following the same modern monetary theory, although it doesn't claim that. And what I would like to suggest is that we can have an ideal central bank act, but unless we have fiscal discipline to regulate or have some fiscal consolidation, it's impossible. I can remember that when Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy was the governor, he made a valiant attempt to adopt the inflation targeting monetary policy, and I mentioned it in an article published in FT that Dr. Kumaraswamy was on a suicide mission. You may remember that. I said the central bank was on a suicide mission. Why I said that is that he tried to manage monetary policy in a conducive manner while allowing the fiscal authorities to go freely handle their fiscal affairs. I mean, there was no expenditure control. There was no tax mobilization efforts. So I think it is important that the fiscal discipline should be established before we making any attempt to make a central bank independent. And in this case, I would like to make a note on the Fiscal Management and Responsibility Act, which was enacted in the Parliament in 2002. And the main objectives of the act was to reduce government deficit, to reduce the budget deficit to about 5% of GDP. And secondly, the total government liabilities, including external debt, should not exceed 60% of GDP, commencing 2039. So what happened is those were the targets: 5% of GDP budget deficit, and debt to GDP ratio should not exceed 60%. But what we are experiencing today is that the budget deficit is over 12 to maybe around nearly 15% of GDP, and the total government debt is over 110% of GDP. So the successive governments have postponed this Fiscal Management and Responsibility Act over and over again. And last year, the current government postpone the implementation of the Fiscal Responsibility and Management Act until 2030, another 6 or 7 years. So this is the thing. So the same, I hope the new central bank act will not face the same fate, because you can have an ideal law, but the parliament can always overrule the law. We are in Sri Lanka. So the fiscal authorities have failed to comply with the rules of the budget deficit and debt as stipulated in FRMA. So the legal, or what is called de jure fiscal targets enforced by the Act have little meaning in actual practice, de facto. This happens both in monetary policy as well as in fiscal policy. And there's the question of reconciling central bank independence and democracy. I agree with Professor Nicholas that this kind of independence given to the central bank might erode the democratic value because the particular group of elitists in the central bank can control the economy. So in order to overcome that problem, the current act has a few clauses, namely, firstly, the minister and the central bank have to sign a monetary policy framework agreement to setting out the inflation target to be achieved by the CBS, Central Bank of Sri Lanka. So the central bank is going to adopt inflation targeting monetary policy framework. That was the attempt made by Dr. Kumaraswamy a few years ago. And secondly, the minister has to publish the monetary policy framework and agreement, including inflation target and other parameters relating thereto in the Gazette within a period of 1 week. So that is the disclosure or transparency clause. And thirdly, the minister and the central bank are required to review the inflation target and any other parameters relating thereto once in every 3 years. And finally, and also, if central bank fails to meet the inflation target by a specified margin for 2 consecutive quarters, the Monetary Policy Board is required to submit a report to the parliament. So those transparency clauses are there, but still there is a flaw, because if the central bank fails, the governor and the Monetary Board have to report to the parliament, but that's the end of it. But in some countries, the governor will be removed from that post if that kind of failure happen, but those clauses are not there. Finally, I would like to say the new central bank is not a panacea for all economic ills that we are facing today. In the backdrop of Sri Lanka's current economic crisis, it is questionable whether this new act will resolve the problems, at least to achieve price stability. And also, I feel that the timing of the new central bank seems problematic. And given the large fiscal deficit, the government is compelled to depend on the central bank and the banking system to borrow money, because the government cannot approach the foreign capital markets given the debt default situation. And therefore, it will be extremely difficult for the government. In fact, the government will not be able to survive without borrowing from the banking system. So it will be extremely difficult to implement practically this, implement the new Central Bank Act at this moment. And it's also, I would like to reiterate that fiscal discipline is essential. And therefore, the central bank independence, I admit that central bank independence is a necessary but not a sufficient condition. And by and large, independence of any central bank depends on the credibility and strength of the governor, who is administering the particular institution to resist the political pressures. We have seen in recent times that is not the case in Sri Lanka. The central bank monetary board had to listen to the government, and as a result, the particular objectives envisaged in the current Monetary Law Act were not fulfilled. And I would finally say that the need for a new act, new central bank act, would not have arisen had the central bank conducted its monetary policy strictly in accordance with the current Monetary Law Act, which already provides sufficient independence and scope. So thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kolomage. Yes, absolutely, you are right. And the term independence is misleading, and we need to take that term in the context and in which areas that the central bank has been independent, has been made independent in the new act, and in which areas that it has been continuing in the same way. When you need to look at its commitment to the government for credit financing the budget deficit, and also the appointment of the governor and the members, and the composition of those boards. So in those areas, I think we need to look at how it is independent. I know we are approaching the last presentation, but before that, I want to remind you, we have time only for a couple of questions and comments, and after this presentation, so those who are joining online, they can send those questions. Few of them we take, depending on the time constraint, to the chat box. They can forward them to the chat box. Okay, Dr. Indrajit Kumarasamy, I know that you have been waiting for these occasions. The whole floor is yours.
Let me begin by thanking the SLIA as well as the Students Association for inviting me, and Professor Sirimal Aberatne in particular, who got in touch with me. You know, I think we're getting what Howard suggested we should have, which is a very rich debate. We've already seen that there's been quite a lot of pushback in terms of the way the new central bank bill has been formulated, and many questions have been asked, and those questions deserve to be asked. So this is a debate that certainly should take place. But let me just share some remarks with you. I'll try to keep it short because it's now late in the day. You know, if you go back to John Exeter's report that he submitted at the time the central bank was set up, he actually addressed the issue of central bank independence. He made the case for the new central bank to be non-political and to have considerable amount of independence. He pointed out that central banks deal with problems which are of a long-term nature and are unusually technical in nature as well. So it was important that they should not be infused with narrow political thinking, which tends to be very short disorientation. So the whole kind of the way central banks operate, the subject matter they deal with are such that it requires a long-term perspective, and that goes very powerfully against the 4 or 5 year political cycle of a country. So you need to somehow create some space between the central bank and the polity. Now, having said that, Exeter also recognized that the central bank had to work in close harmony with the government of the day, particularly in matters related to fiscal policy. And he stressed that there should be effective fiscal monetary coordination. Now, if you look back at our 75-year post-independence history, that has not really taken place. What we have had for much of that time is fiscal domination of monetary policy. successive governments had difficulty in running fiscal policy in a responsible and sustainable way. And then they relied on the central bank to bail them out, either through direct deficit financing or through financial repression by the central bank, which kept interest rates low for the governments to be able to borrow cheaply. All these things actually dislocate the economy and create disturbances in the economy. Now, we've had a discussion on those matters, so I don't want to repeat what has been said. So now that we have this fiscal forbearance in monetary policy, one needs to find ways of creating sufficient space for the central bank to do its work in a technically proficient way. Now, having said that, if you look at the Act, the central bank does not have policy autonomy. Far from controlling fiscal policy, it doesn't even control monetary policy, because the inflation target, which is at the heart of the monetary policy formulation framework, is actually set jointly through consultation between the Ministry of Finance and the central bank. And the inflation target is actually announced by the Minister of Finance through a gazette. It's not announced by the governor. It's not announced by the governance board. It's not announced by the Monetary Policy Board. It's announced by the Minister of Finance through a gazette of the government. So you can't say that the central bank is kind of going off and doing its own thing. And so there is no real policy autonomy for the central bank. Of course, it has a big say and a big input into setting that policy target, inflation target. But what it does get now, to a greater extent, is instrument autonomy. So that it is able, once it's given the target through the government gazette issued by the Minister of Finance, it has autonomy in the way it runs monetary and exchange rate policy. So there is no question of the central bank superseding the political authority of the country. Because as I said, the policy framework is set by the gazette notification issued by the Minister of Finance. Then, if I can go on, in terms of the relationship between the money supply and inflation. Now, from my understanding, if the rate of growth of the money supply is faster than the nominal growth rate of the economy, I don't see how there cannot be pressure on prices. Because if you see that, the money supply is growing faster than the supply, the nominal value of goods and services in the economy, then that has to be some give in terms of the price level. So I don't think one can say that there is no linkage. But as Dr. Kolomage pointed out, the central bank recognized that the relationship between monetary aggregates and inflation had got much weaker, and it had abandoned setting monetary policy by using monetary aggregates as the base. And Dr. Kolomage explained how it has conducted monetary policy in the last sort of 15, 20 years, I think. And if you make the point that inflation has been there all over the world recently, that is absolutely true. The supply side factors have pushed inflation up all over the world, but I'm not aware of many countries which have had 85% inflation. So you have lots of these supply bottlenecks, all these various other factors which have affected Sri Lanka and other countries. But then why did ours go up to 85%? So that, I think, is something that needs investigation. I haven't done the work to be able to say that large part of it is due to monetary expansion, but or deficit financing. But it's something I think that we need to look at. Why did ours go up so much? Way above almost every other country. Then, counter-cyclical capacity for counter-cyclical policies. Clearly, that's very important. If a country, like the country is hit by something like the pandemic or the collapse in export markets, whatever it is, and we need to then have some capacity or significant capacity be able to have counter-cyclical policies. One way, of course, is to get the central bank to do deficit financing, in colloquial parlance, deficit financing. But that, as Dr. Kolomage pointed out, there are a number, and also Professor Nicholas did point out, what are said to be the negative kind of feedback loops that you get. But there are other ways of doing it, most notably to create arbitrage opportunities for open market operations to become attractive to the market, right? Because when you have some kind of depression in the economy, private sector credit demand will also be less. So you won't be crowding out the private sector to quite such an extent if you do open market operations to take money for the government. Then one thing I want to basically discuss with Howard is that whether people congratulated us on our fiscal performance. To be honest, I had a conversation with a very close friend at the IMF in 2020, and he said, "You guys are dead in the water. You're going to have a crisis. It's inevitable because of the tax cuts and the pandemic hitting us." So they were not congratulating us for running a large surplus. My understanding is they said, "You guys did not leave yourself enough of a buffer to have a fiscal stimulus." And in fact, we didn't. We had, I've seen a table of fiscal stimulus in South Asia. Now, South Asia doesn't have the most powerful economies in the world, right? We were by far the smallest fiscal stimulus, by far, because we didn't have the capacity to have a fiscal stimulus. Professor Lakshman had to work very hard to support the economy through the banking system and the central bank. So that is how we were able to basically keep things afloat. It wasn't through countercyclical fiscal policy. Then in terms of this volatility we are seeing now, and this is my personal view, and of course I could well be wrong, but I think it is a function of trying to do the impossible trinity. We tried to hold down interest rates and keep the exchange rate up. And in economics, there is this Mandela's theory, they call it, that you can't do both at the same time. So that, I think, by trying to do that over a period of time, that has created imbalances in the economy, which is now creating the volatility. And it will take some time for us to work through these imbalances and to get to a more stable outcome. On foreign influence, this is something that one needs to think very carefully about. From the years of work that I've done with the IMF never ever goes into a country without being invited to come. The country has to invite the IMF to come. Otherwise, they're not interested. And, I remember the time I was in the central bank, I had the rather shameful experience of being the only country in the Asia-Pacific region to have an IMF program. No other country. Pakistan is not in the Asia-Pacific region. It's in West Asia. No other country in the Asia-Pacific region had an IMF program. We were the only one. For a brief period, Mongolia had it because they are a commodity economy and their commodity prices collapsed. But other than that, we were the only people who had an IMF program. So if countries manage their affairs well, as most countries in Asia do, you don't have to go to China. You don't have to go anywhere near the IMF. But if you mess things up as we do again and again, and we mess it up in the same way. That's what's really, unusual. Why do we do the same thing again and again? I can't understand. So I think we have to break out of these bad habits. And to break out of these bad habits, we need to tie our hands. And that is where I think I agree very much with Professor Columbage. First thing we need to do is to tighten up the fiscal rules in the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act. And we should make the primary target, the primary balance in the budget. That should be what we need to target and make sure that's in surplus. And so I don't know whether you're the foremost constitutional authority in the country. Can we have a supermajority to change the targets of the fiscal, create a supermajority to have that more discipline imposed? And similarly, where the fiscal rules will be bringing more discipline on the fiscal side, the new central bank bill is designed to bring in discipline on the monetary side. One thing, of course, is that the central bank can no longer participate in the primary auctions for treasury bills. Actually, the Monetary Board, I think it was in 2017, took a decision that it would not participate in the primary auctions. And interestingly, and again, this I can't say there is causality, it may simply be correlation, and we need to do more analysis and research to find out whether it's true. But in those 2 years, 2017 and 2018, those were two of only 4 years since 1954 that Sri Lanka had a surplus in the primary balance. Now, whether there is a relationship between the central bank being much tougher in terms of the money it was willing to give the government and this better fiscal performance, I don't know. But in 2019, it all went wrong. Elections came and we were back to square one. But that it's interesting. We need to study that more carefully and see how that did work at the time. Let me just finish by saying that really we need to do things differently. And since 1950 or 48, really, it is macroeconomic stress that has been the main cause of Sri Lanka's poor performance. When you have macroeconomic stress almost continuously, it is very difficult to increase productivity and have a sustained growth of the economy because it's tough to do structural reforms when there is volatility in the economy. And I suspect in the next year or two, we're going to find the same thing. It's not easy. And so, and we need to get over this hump in terms of the sources of macroeconomic stress. And as I say, in my view, stronger fiscal rules and new monetary law, which gives the central bank instrument autonomy. It's a political authority has to set the policy. But once that is set, the central bank should be given a full rein to achieve that target by using its technical expertise to achieve that target. And in the instruments it has at its disposal are monetary and exchange rate policy. Let me stop with that. Thank you. I think there was a lot of stuff said by the others. Yeah.
We will spend few minutes in taking the questions. And also before we start, I can also invite some of you to make some comments if you need, maybe 2 minutes. Comments and the questions, and also those who are joining online, they can post their questions to the chat box and I receive them here. Yes, go ahead, Mr. Lakshman Siriwardhan.
This is a comment, and I was surprised. Central Bank Independent Act is being discussed by prominent ex-central bankers and Harvard and all. Nobody asked the question that in case this kind of act is implemented, can we prevent what happened, the infamous or famous central bank bond scam? Because it's very relevant today. Not only because in this panel it is relevant because there's somebody who took call soon after Arjuna Mahendran episode, and with this central bank act, do you think, Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy, honestly, you can prevent this kind of situations? I doubt it very much, because finally, who is going to appoint governor? Who is going to appoint the monetary board? Be honest, be simple. You know, this is in this kind of corrupt and culture that has been destroyed over a period of time, many times. How can, I know that this is a very tough question, but I didn't hear any words like that. I think always we try to, shape up and not to antagonize people, not to say something that we need to say so that our positions and future positions will be safeguarded. But what do you think? Please.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Mr. Lakshman. But by the way, before we answer that question, before we answer that question, can I invite the panel, the speakers to come to the stage? So, come, Dr. Kumaraswamy, you can also. Okay.
I absolve myself of any responsibility for should I stand up a little?
No, it's okay. Mike is coming.
Thank you. I don't think it's impossible to say it will never happen again, but I can say that many measures have been taken to minimize the possibility of it ever happening again. Simple things like CCTV cameras, taking away the mobile phones of the traders, plus having now quite strict guidelines for the EPF's investment policy and having greater senior oversight of the EPF operations. So like that, I mean, there are lots of things. Now I'm getting older, not. Pardon me? No, but that is to. No. But the act isn't the bond scam was due to operational matters, right? And which could have been done a lot better. The weakness in the operational matters allowed the opportunity for people to creep through and do these things. But that one thing I should have said at the end, you can have the most elaborate and best law in the world. I'm sure Professor Pires will agree with this. But in the end, it comes down to people. Really, if you have to act in good faith. So that we have to find a way of becoming a society that acts in good faith. But otherwise, we're not going to get very far.
Thank you, Dr. Kumaraswamy. And the questions, it's good that if you identify yourself, because our students and they want to know who you are, what you are, and the good characteristics of a good question. It has to be short and sweet and straightforward, unless it is a comment. Anyway, we have received two questions also from the chat box, and the first one, I get the second one first, is to Dr. Harvard. Explain more on the danger of the central bank going under the control of foreign parties with the new act.
I actually don't think there's anything in the new act which explicitly indicates this. What I'm saying is that this has been a tendency for a very, very long time to try and bypass the democratic process by making this institution, which is probably the most important economic institution in any country, unaccountable. Now, I gave the example of the United States, where there is no audited account of the Federal Reserve. And that is because the Federal Reserve does many things that it does not want the public to know about. We know that. I mean, they even fund all manner of dubious organizations outside the country. Now, Janet Yellen explained that very explicitly to Donald Trump when Donald Trump said he wanted the Federal Reserve to be audited. And that was his second major promise. The first one was the wall, you remember, to keep out the immigrants from the United States. But the second was to audit the Federal Reserve, because there's a lot of discussion about the Federal Reserve, not just doing things like that, but transferring money to the elites in the society. Unknown to many people, in 2011, when there was a partial audit, it was established that the Federal Reserve actually printed $12 trillion in 2008-9, $12 trillion, and transferred that to the banking community. And the banking community restored their balance sheets with that. Why? Why the banking community? What about all the other businesses in a country? What about the ordinary people who lost their homes, etc.? Why the privileged banking community? This time round, the estimate is $30 trillion. $30 trillion in 2021. That is the current estimate, but nobody knows this for sure because there's no audited set of accounts. Now, when you have this very close relationship, I mean, let's put it this way, governor of the central bank, the monetary committee, they are all prey to people in the private sector, especially in the financial sector, cultivating them. Okay, it's not that they're being bribed directly, but we know it happens in country after country. We know that they're given seats on boards and all sorts of things after they retire. We know that, and therefore, they want the policies implemented in this way. Look, we've just had, sorry, I'll just finish here. The greatest printing of money in the history of modern capitalism by the Federal Reserve, the ECB, and the Japanese central bank. Was any of that discussed in any parliament, in any democratic system? No. And we now know that that resulted in a huge transfer of wealth to the rich elites. Huge. We've never seen anything like it ever before. Why? Because the Federal Reserve dropped interest rates to 0, lent it to banks at 0.75%, and banks on-lent it to people like Donald Trump at 0.75, sorry, and Donald Trump puts it into treasury bills at 3.25%. He told the world that. He told the world that. This is how he was making money while Ben Bernanke was the chair of the Federal Reserve. Now, again, look at what's happening in Sri Lanka now. You have interbank market rates at, let's say, 15, 16%, and you have treasury bills at 32%. This is shooting fish in a barrel. The banks are actually taking depositors' money, taking interbank money, and buying treasury bills. That's how they're restoring their balance sheets. Why should banks have this privilege? Why is the central bank allowing this? Now, this is what I mean by the banks having more and more influence on monetary policy committee and central bank governors and so on and so forth, where eventually you're going to have the monetary policy corrupted to benefiting a few elite entities.
Sorry.
Thanks, sir.
Can I say just one thing? The
Yeah.
very high interest rates are also a function of the very high risk premium due to the domestic debt restructuring. So I think that's the margin part of that is that, and as that works through the system, it will come down. The interest rates will come down.
Yeah, you can keep the mic actually. The next question is maybe for you. Until you are ready with your questions, and I'm going to put forward these things which we have got in the chat box. And what do the panelists think about following revisions to the proposed bill? And there are two things. Governor and deputy governors are prohibited of holding any office after their retirement, number one. Number two, Ministry of Finance present their views at every monetary policy review meetings. Any comments on that? Under the new act and after the retirement, are they allowed to hold any other positions?
Well, I think there's a case for saying at the moment, the practice is that you can't hold any position in an entity regulated by the central bank for a period of 1 year. You have to have a cooling off period of 1 year. You can make that longer, whatever. I mean, there is some merit in having some kind of maybe longer cooling off period. I think it's not a good idea to confuse the monetary policy should be made. I think even the new monetary policy board, in my view, is perhaps a little bit too broad in its membership. That it should be really a specialized entity which is focused very much on formulating monetary policy in a very technically competent way. So if you bring the Treasury in, as we've seen historically, there's a lot of pressure that comes to set monetary policy, to finance the deficit, or to make money cheaper for the government to borrow. So I mean, I don't think that's a good idea.
Yeah. Okay. The second one is the space for the finance ministry to present their views under the new act.
So there is a coordinating council, I think it's called, which meets every quarter, and the composition of that coordinating council is the governor, the ST, and the secretary to the Ministry of Economic Affairs or Economic Policy, if that person is separate from the ST, if you have a separate ministry. So I think that forum is intended to give an opportunity for people to really have this kind of conversation that is envisaged in this question. But that body does not have any decision-making power.
But ST is no more in the monetary board.
No, ST is not in the governance board. He's not in the monetary policy board.
There's a question from Professor Gunarwan. Please clearly state which provision in the new bill stipulates accountability of the central bank to general public or their democratic institutions. Is there accountability? Any clauses?
There are a number of things. One thing is, which we've already talked about, if the target is missed for 2 successive quarters, then a letter has to be written to the minister explaining why the target was missed, what measures are being taken to get the path back on track, and thirdly, how long it's going to take to get back on target. So that's part of the accountability. Then also, I think there is more than accountability, it's really transparency. The central bank, in addition to the annual report and the recent economic development, all the publications it does now, there's going to be a new publication called, I think it's the Inflation Outlook, which will be put out once every 6 months. And that will give a very detailed analysis of how monetary policy is being formulated, how it's been formulated, and also to be forward-looking in terms of giving guidance as to where inflation is going in the economy. So again, it's a mixture of transparency and accountability. That really, because once the central bank gives those inflation outlooks, the public will be able to hold them to account if things are badly wrong, if they get it
Yeah.
badly wrong. Sure.
Yes.
Really designed to ensure independence. I think the monetary board will consist of 6 persons who will be appointed by the president on the recommendation of the Minister of Finance. Then the same procedure applies to the appointment of 2 members of the Monetary Policy Board. Furthermore, according to the provisions of the bill which has been presented to Parliament, the President or the Minister of Finance can select at his sole discretion somebody completely outside the system and appoint him Deputy Governor of the Central Bank. Then the tenure of office of the governor, the tenure of the present governor is 12 years, but the tenure of his successor, whoever that might be, is totally undefined, right? So I find difficulty in understanding if the real objective is independence, right? Then why not use the Constitutional Council? Now we have 9 so-called independent commissions, right? And the procedure is for applications to be called for. People are interviewed. There is an objective process of evaluation. So if you're going to give untrammeled, absolutely unqualified discretion to a politician to appoint all the members of the monetary board, right? No restrictions, nothing at his will and pleasure. Then isn't there a fundamental anomaly? You're trying to achieve independence. Independence from whom? Parliament has the responsibility under Article 148 to control public finance. Then is there independence from the executive? The executive is completely, absolutely in control. So how does one talk of independence?
So as I'm still a member of an advisory committee to the government, I'm going to answer your question very obliquely. In the sense that, Dr. W.M. Tilakaratne, I don't know whether you remember him, sir. He was ST as well as deputy governor, an extremely wise man. And once when I was raging about something that was not right, as I thought, he said, Indrajit, don't let the excellent be the enemy of the good. So in this act, there's a lot of good stuff, in my view. So I say, take what you can at this time, and let those who have the capacity to advocate and agitate do so to correct some of the difficulties that there are. This is not a perfect act, particularly in terms of autonomy of the central bank. So I think one hopes it will be a process where things get better as time goes on. Yeah. In terms of appointments, in terms of appointments and removal, yeah. Hmm.
Appointments are still under the political authorities. Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Right. Not even the president, but even the ministers.
Correct.
That's a good point. Yeah.
I'm not
There's
sure the IMF will be that bothered about
Sorry.
actual appointment process. They leave that
I agree with you.
internal as an internal affair.
There's also an important question here, another important question. Given the limited fiscal space and the state capacity in generating revenue, don't you see that the removal of provisional advances to the government under the new Act would put further pressure on the economy in maintaining the stability if we implement it soon. We know that during the COVID pandemic and central banks actually supported all over the world. Yeah.
I mean, I actually had something more fundamental relating to this, and going back to both you and Professor Colombogay, I noticed you did not address the most fundamental thing I said, that Sri Lanka will be almost uniquely the only central bank in the world to just focus on inflation. And I find that really strange. You know, it's like we're being taken for a ride. You know, the IMF is telling us you are the only central bank. We want to focus on inflation. So they don't actually say, well, look, all these other countries in the world are also only focusing on inflation. So why does the monetary law have that? Second thing, Indrajit, that both you and and Professor Colombogay, sorry, you have not addressed this thing I told you, that most of the monetary literature actually says there is no relationship between the cash base and M2 and inflation. You know, I know logically you were trying to think that way because maybe that at your time when you learned that, that was the case. But if I just refer you to all the most recent literature, and it's a consensus now, that when commercial banks extend credit, they actually increase M2. And when M2 increases, then the commercial banks have to go to the money markets and increase their cash borrowings. So the sequence is credit, M2, cash. Exactly the reverse of what we were taught in textbooks. And that's why they're all saying, please correct the textbooks. And I'm saying, please educate our central bank, because our central bank doesn't seem to understand any of the recent literature. You know, I mean, this is, I'm getting grayer by the second because it's driving me.
He got that too.
Sorry. Yes.
Let me.
Thank you, Sirimal. Yes, I agree with you that, you know, there's a causation between money supply and, monetary base and money supply, broad money supply. That is what you mentioned.
It's completely, so it's credit, broad money.
Okay,
cash.
okay, yes. This is called endogenous money supply, endogenous money supply. Let me explain. We are always fighting endogenous money supply because traditionally the monetary theorists believed that central bank reserve base, you said cash base, you know, results in or causes overall money supply. But there's also an alternative view that the demand for money in the market influences the monetary base. I think that is what you meant.
Can I just?
Yes.
Sorry. I'm going to clarify again, because I also disagree with the various central banks of the world in a different sense, but let me repeat it now again. There's now a general consensus all over the world. There's actually, Sri Lanka is the only country in the world that has this uniquely different view. It's a view that came from 40 years ago. And what it is today is you can go to Bank of England site, you can go to the Federal Reserve site.
Yeah, I will get it.
And they will tell you that the starting point is credit expansion, leading to increase in M2, leading to increase in the cash base. And he says it's endogenous, but everyone now agrees, everybody except for Sri Lanka. So I would like Sri Lankan central bankers and academics who believe this to start challenging the whole world and say, sorry, we have a unique theory that nobody else in the world has today because we have found something you haven't found. I mean, that is the situation today. If you just go to these central bank sites, you will see that they have a different view. If cash base is endogenous, there's no justification for asking the central bank not to print money and finance the budget deficit. That's the whole point, because it's not the cash base that causes inflation. And now, I just tell you one thing, Indrajit. What happened for our inflation rate to rise by 80 to 90%? What happened just before it rose? What happened? Exactly. The exchange rate depreciates. In other words, the costs to all producers rise, and that causes prices to rise, not just in Sri Lanka, but everywhere in the world. So in other countries, they didn't have a depreciation, but they still had to pay higher oil prices. You ask, what's the difference for Sri Lanka? We, along with Zambia, along with a number of sub-Saharan African countries, had major currency depreciations. That's why our inflation was relatively higher. In other words, it is from price to credit to M2 to cash. And this is where the problem I have with the IMF. IMF's report, World Bank's report, UNDP's report, they all say it's partly to do with money stock, partly to do with oil prices, partly to do with other factors. Sorry, this is theoretically incorrect. Milton Friedman says you can have wages rising 150%. Will you get inflation? No. He says you can have oil prices rising 100%. Will you get inflation? He says no. The only thing that causes inflation, that's what he said, is printing money to finance the budget deficit. Now all of that has been overturned. So when the IMF writes in a report that it's money supply and oil prices, they're talking nonsense. You know, I mean, I can't believe that they even write such a thing and nobody has corrected them.
If the money supply is growing faster than the nominal growth rate, how is it possible for there not to be pressure on prices?
Let me repeat again, Indrajit. Yeah. Credit expands, then money stock expands, then the cash base expands. Now you keep talking about M2 rising above GDP increase, but not nominal. It's got to be real. It's got to be real because it's got to be, nominal includes inflation.
Yeah, that's right. So if your money supply is growing faster than the nominal growth of money supply, right? Not inflation. Money supply is growing faster than nominal growth. There has to be pressure on
real GDP. If my M2 grows, okay. But let me repeat it again, Indrajit. Please go to the sites and have a look. Credit, M2, cash base. Nowhere do they now say excess M2 causes inflation. Nowhere. If you can, give it to me. But if not, please give it to the IMF and ask them, why have you advised us in this way? Please do that, because then you will be honest to Sri Lanka. You know, because I think what they're doing is they're taking us for a ride. I would like one of their people to come as well and explain it to me. I mean, they have all these American academics. I would like them to actually go to the Federal Reserve site and say, see here, Federal Reserve says this. They can't do it because I'm reading the Federal Reserve's site and their training site every single day. Credit expansion, M2, cash base.
I think, two former central bankers.
A brief comment on the IMF. In fact, we don't have to go to the IMF if we keep our house in order. You know, we have to do our own housekeeping. Whether we go to the IMF with the IMF or without the IMF, we have to keep our house clean. I think Dr. Indrajit mentioned that our house is in a mess for the last so many years. So we have to resort to some helper. You know, that's what happened. And the former governor is not here. He didn't want to go to the IMF. So IMF didn't ask us to come there to Washington. No. No, I think, let me finish it. Don't get antagonized. No, that is my personal view. I didn't. If you don't want to safeguard Lakshman.
No. So
I don't have any-
Professor Laxman has filed 2 letters with the Supreme Court. The 2 letters show quite categorically that he actually advised the government that they were headed for a crisis in March of 2021. I'm sorry he left. Then when the president or PB Jayasundara didn't accept that they should go for bilateral funding, he said, if you're not going for bilateral funding, you should go to IMF. There is a letter with the Supreme Court where he even recommends that they go to the IMF. Now, what has happened is people are covering their backs and accusing Professor Laxman because he's an old world bureaucrat. He doesn't wash his dirty linen in public. But it is now a record. It is a record that you can check. These are 2 letters given to the Supreme Court. That is why he will not have an action filed against him. And these sorts of allegations are not correct.
No, this is not an allegation. This is a intellectual debate. So since there's a court case, Professor GLP said, no, I don't want to get into that. But what I want to say is that I just mentioned that IMF says that the member country should have the ownership of any adjustment program. I participated in IMF programs, and I am not brainwashed by the IMF. Right? But the fact of the matter is our house is in a mess. We have mismanaged the economy, and Professor Nicholas mentioned about inflation and exchange rate depreciation. Of course, you can't isolate exchange rate depreciation or prices. They are interrelated. When there's an increase in the money supply, it leads to accelerate inflation. That will lead to erode the exchange rate of any economy. So that is what has happened. We have mismanaged the economy. We had a high fiscal deficit. I could mention this during my presentation. The government withdrew taxes. The government slashed the taxes in 2019. And as a result, the government lost about 700 to 800 billion a year from tax revenue. So as a result, the government had to resort to the central bank. I won't blame the former governor or any governor here. So the former governor was pressurized by the fiscal authorities to give us money. So that's what happened. So the root cause of the problem is fiscal indiscipline, fiscal imbalance that has led to so many economic ills like balance of payments crisis, exchange rate depreciation, shortage of essential commodities, inflation. We are experiencing very high hyperinflation, in fact, not inflation, hyperinflation. So I think I will conclude, but I would like to re-stress that we can't just blame the IMF. We have to do the macroeconomic balancing with or without the IMF. So that is my...
Thank you, Professor Kolomge. Dr. Kumaraswamy has something.
On the objectives of the central bank. You're absolutely right. The primary objective is achieve and maintain domestic price stability. Then there's another objective, which is secure financial system stability. Clearly, price stability is the number 1. But however, in that same section on objectives of the CBSL, it goes on to say price stability objectives should take into account inter alia the stabilization of output targets towards its potential level. I mean, the central bank is not a development bank, right? That's right. I mean, I agree with you entirely, by the way, that development bank should never have been given up. But that's a different story. It's not a development bank. It has to only basically make sure that output targets are stabilized towards the potential level. So that's there. It's not. It kind of goes on to expand on the primary objective. So growth is not ignored, but it says you should not go beyond the potential target, potential growth level. So that it doesn't ignore it. It doesn't ignore it. It's there in the section on objectives of the CBSL. It says, as I said,
when they talk about the agreement on targets, it's only inflation that is mentioned. They don't have a growth target.
There isn't a growth target, but it says that when you're making policy, you need to take into account.
But for all other central banks, a growth target is there.
No, that's Federal Reserve.
Federal Reserve has a growth target. No, he has employment. Sorry. Okay. Employment has target. But Reserve Bank of India and the State Bank of Pakistan has growth targets.
Central banks don't have growth because it's a conflict of interest
story. It's not a development bank. It has to only do it based.
All about stability, right? So it has to make sure it's stability. So you can stabilize around the potential, but not become a development bank and just promote growth. For that, you set up a development bank. I'm all for it. In fact, in the time I was in the central bank,
Basically, make sure that output targets are.
That's what the government should do, not get the central bank to do the development bank.
No, it's not that, Indrajit. If I raise interest rates, it damages growth.
Yeah.
So if I'm targeting inflation, I have to take into consideration what it's going to do to growth.
Yeah.
I mean, it's as simple as that. Therefore, when the central bank is following monetary policies, it needs to understand that that's going to have growth implications.
But then you must also take into account the fact that inflation is the most anti-poor thing that you can have in the world. It absolutely hammers the poor. They don't have assets to hedge against
Price rises. So, it is such an anti-poor thing. The most pro-poor thing a central bank can do is to keep inflation low. And, once you've got inflation low, then you can,
Have you seen the most recent studies of the World Bank? The most pro-poor thing they can do is create employment.
But you can't create employment in a situation of high growth.
That's where we come back to the discussion.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you. Thank you, Howard. And thank you, Dr. Kumar Sain. Thank you, Professor Columbia. And let's put our hands together to the wonderful panel that we had today. And I'm sorry that we can continue this discussion for a couple of hours more, but our tea is getting cold. And may I invite Hansi for the vote of thanks. Thank you. Come.
Reference to Federal Reserve or Bank of England. I mean, you just set the ratio because I've got some things that are long discredited.
Ladies and gentlemen, as we edge closer to the end of today's proceedings, it is of great importance that we take a moment to acknowledge and appreciate those that work tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure that today's event was a success. Thus, we'd now like to invite our very own Shihara Pereira, Vice President of Economic Students Association of University of Colombo, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Okay, very good morning all. Very good evening. I would like to make this an opportunity to extend my gratitude to eminent panelists for taking time off your busy schedules to grace these occasions with your preference. Also the moderator, Professor Abeyratna, for conducting this enlightening discussion smoothly. And let me make this an opportunity to thank the Vice Chancellor of University of Colombo, Professor Karunaratna, Dean of Faculty of Arts, University of Colombo, Lasantha Manawadu, Professor Alut Gay, Head of the Department of Economics, University of Colombo, Faculty of Arts, and Professor Reverend Sir W. Vimalaratna, and all the lecturers and non-academic staff for your utmost support and guidance in making today's event success. Sri Lanka Economic Association and Economic Student Association, University of Colombo, thank you very much for your hard work in putting together event success. Moreover, I would like to thank you media partners for the day for joining to cover this fruitful discussion. Last but not the least, let me thank you today's audience who joined virtually as well as physically with us in here, University of Colombo. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shihara. Once again, we hope that today's session proved to be a productive one in your view. And that brings us to the end of today's session. Should central bank be independent? Guests, all of you are invited to join for a small refreshment after the event. However, before we step on to refreshments, there is a humble request from all the panelists to join us for a photograph with the audience and with the organizing committee as well. And with that being said, I am Hansi Paboda, your host, signing off for today. Thank you very much.
Recording stopped.